Today I'm going to be showing you two different ways how to make a monochromatic color scale in Photoshop. As with most design software, there are several ways to do any given thing. I'm going to show you two today and kind of explain why you'd want to do one over the other. So first we need a document to work with, so I'm just going to go to File, New, and under Preset I'm just going to select US Paper, which is going to give me a basic 8.5 by 11 inch document. And what I want to do first is to kind of create some guides for myself. As you can see, I have the rulers on, and the way you turn that on is just to go under View and Rulers. Control or Command R is the shortcut there. As you can see, mine are set to pixels, and you can change that by going to File, or I'm sorry, Edit, Preferences, Units and Rulers. And I'm going to change it to inches and hit OK. So now you can see the rulers are now set at inches. Now I want to create some guides, so I'm just going to click on either the horizontal or vertical ruler and drag it over, and as you can see, when I do that, it creates some guides for me. So I'm just going to make, since we need to do 7 steps in this monochromatic scale, I'm just going to create 7 spots here. And we'll make sure it's nice and centered later. Alright, there we go. And then I'll just create 2 there. So now you can see kind of where I'm going to start creating those colors. So the first thing I want to do is kind of to choose a color to work with, and just for time's sake I'm just going to grab this green right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new layer. I'm just going to say base color. And I want to just put that base color here in the center spot. So I'm just going to grab the rectangular marquee tool. And now that I have these guides, you're going to find that the marquee tool is going to snap to them. So once I have that, I'm going to use my paint bucket tool and make sure that the color I want is in the foreground. And again, if you don't see the paint bucket, it's probably behind the gradient tool. And having that new layer selected, I'm going to dump that color in. All right. I'm going to deselect, just hit Control D. So now if I turn that layer on and off, you can see there's my base color. So again, there's 2 ways you can go about kind of making your scale. One way to do it is to kind of use a gradient as a reference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a reference for myself down here. And I'm going to take the marquee tool and I'm going to select these 7 spots. And I want to make this on a new layer, and I will call it reference. So what I'm going to do is use the gradient tool. So I'm going to go back to the paint bucket, hold down, and go over to the gradient. And to adjust this, I just click on it, right? On that gradient. And what I want to do is, you can see the default is a black and white gradient. It starts at black and moves over to white. If it isn't like that, just click at the preset and put it back to where it is, or where it needs to be. So if you click down here, it's going to create another value right in the middle, and it's going to use whatever color you in the foreground you had to make that. So I'm just going to hit OK. As you can see, that new gradient appears up there. So now you get the little crosshairs, and I want you to click on one side of this marquee that you created and drag the line all the way over. As you can see, it moves in any direction, but if you hold down Shift, it'll make sure it stays horizontal. Now when you get to the other side of the marquee, let go. So now, as you can see, it has started. Actually, I have made a mistake, because you need to start based on the assignment. You need to start at black and move over to white. So I'm just going to go to my history channel and go back to gradient. A couple steps, sorry, before I put the gradient down. So since it's starting that way, I'm just going to start the other direction, because I want it to start at black on the left-hand side and move over to white on the right. Hit deselect. So now I'm just going to use this layer as a reference to kind of create my other swatches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in this next field over here, and I'm going to use the marquee tool to give myself a guide, and I'm going to go back up to my base color layer. You can also create a new layer. I'm going to do that just because, you know, I like to be organized. So I'll just say, since when you add white to a color, that's going to create tints. When you add black to a color, it creates shades. So I'm just going to call this first one tint 01. Right? So now what I'm going to do is I need to add a little white to this color. So since we have the gradient for a reference, what I'm going to do is go to the eyedropper tool, and I'm just going to click on the middle of this spot right below the marquee. Right? And I'm going to go over to the paint bucket tool and dump it right in there and deselect. As you can see, it's given me another whole step and adding white to that color using the gradient as a reference. So what I want to do then is just going to kind of go down the row and make all the other ones. So tint 02. Another way you can use the eyedropper tool is if you have the paint bucket tool selected, you can just hold down Alt and it turns into the eyedropper. And I'm going to click in the middle here. I'm going to create one here. Another thing you can do is that if you have the marquee tool selected, you can also just click and drag that marquee over. But I want to create a new layer and call this tint 03. And go back to the paint bucket tool, grab the color, and dump it in. So now I want to go the other direction, right? So I'm going to take that marquee tool over there, paint bucket tool, select the color, marquee tool, move it over, paint bucket, select the color, marquee tool, paint bucket, select the color, and dump it in. Now you can feel free to use the shortcuts. I'm not, just so it's a little easier to follow. And I totally did not create new layers for these, so I'm going to go back up here for a little bit and go shade 01. Shade 02. Shade 3. Alright. So now we don't need the gradient anymore, so I'm just going to get rid of that. And you can hide the guides by going to View, View, Show, and then uncheck Guides. And you can also hit Control semicolon. So there you have a basic. You can see that I have a little problem here with shade 01. So I'm going to click on that layer. You can see there's a gap there. So I'm just going to go to Edit Transform. Let's go to Scale and just kind of close that gap so it looks nice and clean. So there I have one scale completed. And I'm just going to create a new folder here in Layers and just say, call this Scale 01. And I'm going to grab all those colors and put it inside there. So now I can just toggle that one on and off. So there's one monochromatic scale. Now this is great it works, but this is because the problem with this way of doing it this way is that it's not entirely accurate. One of the goals of this assignment is to make sure that all the steps are even. And since you're just kind of using the eyedropper to kind of grab colors from this gradient, it's not as precise as it could be. So I'm going to create another scale. I'm just going to turn this one off in a similar manner. Well, it's going to achieve a similar result, but it's going to be more accurate in terms of how many steps, how even the steps are. So I'm going to turn the guides back on. And I don't need that extra one right there. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to select all 7 steps. And I'm going to say, call this, for this method, I'm just going to call this base color. And let's pick another color. Let's take this blue color right there, and I'm going to dump it. So as I said before, adding white to a color creates tints, adding black to a color creates shades. So now we're going to take advantage of some of the layers and opacity in Photoshop to kind of achieve this effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a white solid right here. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call this white. And I'm going to select white from my swatches, go to Paint Bucket, and dump it in there. So what this did effectively is to create a white swatch on top of my base color. So now what I'm going to do is, having that layer selected, I'm going to go right up here to opacity and turn this down to 15%, right? So as you can see, it became 15%, the transparency is down to 15%, so you can see that base color coming through, but it added a little bit of white to it, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer. Let's call this white 15 for 15%. I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to move it over to the next spot. And I'm going to change the opacity, since I want it to go in even steps, and it's at 15% now. I'm going to change it to 30, right? And I'll just name this 30%. And do that again. I'm going to duplicate it, move it over, and I'm going to say white 45%, and change the opacity to 45. So what this did is it is adding white little by little, and I can be very accurate in how much white it's adding by adjusting the opacity. So to add the shades, we do the same thing but with black. So we want to keep that center color the way it is. So I want to move it over to the next spot, choose black, and we'll call this black 15. And I'm going to use the Paint Bucket tool and dump it in there. And I'm going to knock it down to 15%. And you don't have to do 15%. You can choose whatever you want, just as long as the steps are consistent. Duplicate, and I'm going to move it over. Go to 30. Another way you can duplicate when you have the arrow tool is to hit Alt and drag it somewhere, and it will automatically create a copy of it. Oops, and I forgot to rename this one. It's going to be 45. Rename it to 45. Now the great part about this is that anytime I can go back in and change these opacities, which would be much harder to do if you had done it in the first method. So doing it this way is a lot more flexible, and I'm going to show you something that'll make this all even easier. So I'm going to put all of these black and white swatches into one folder, and I'm going to call it Tints and Shades. So since we've already kind of created scale of tints and shades, we can kind of take advantage of that. So what I'm going to do is turn that layer off. I've put that in a folder and I'm just turning it off. So I'm going to go ahead and create 2 more colors. Let's give it some space in between them. And again, I'm being consistent with the size so it looks nice and professional. And I'm just going to put these all in the base color layer. And I'm going to create a marquee there. And let's do a pink here. And make another one down here. And we use a paint bucket tool. Whoops. Let's pick a different color. Okay, so these are going to be my base colors. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this tint and shades thing back on. But what I'm going to do is duplicate it. So I'm going to click that and drag it down to the icon that looks like a little piece of paper. And that's going to create a copy of that. And let's just kind of name these so it doesn't get too confusing. So with that selected, I want to be sure and make sure that auto select is checked off. And I'm going to select that layer and I'm just going to drag that down to the next spot. And as you can see, it took all those tints and shades and it applied it to that second color because I just copied the folder and moved it. And I'm going to do the same thing again. And drag it down. And I'm going to hide those guides so we can look at it clearly. So now, yeah, there needs to be a little bit of tweaking in there. As you can see, there's some gaps. But for the most part, you have 3 monochromatic color scales. So, I mean, while it is true that you could easily, you know, take that first scale and use hue and saturate, you know, flatten it, and use hue on it to try and change it. The second method I showed you is a far more sophisticated way to do it because it allows you to. I could actually, you know, go back to the base color, you know, select one of them, and go to Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation, and I could go there and change that color to anything else I want. So those are two methods you can do it. Again, the first way is a little bit quick and dirty, but keep in mind the second way is going to be a great practice of using opacity and layers to kind of create a more adaptive design solution.